Oh, good afternoon again, everyone. Welcome to the Early Childhood Development in a Time of Pandemic webinar series. Today's topic is supporting parents and educators in uncertain times. This webinar series is being presented by Families Canada and the Centre of Excellence for Early Childhood Development. I am Zindu Saleh. I'm the President and CEO at Families Canada. And today's webinar will be facilitated by Isabelle Vinay. She's an expert in the prevention of disruptive behavior in the early years and executive director at the Centre of Excellence on Early Childhood Development. Today's webinar will highlight the challenges being faced by parents, educators, and caregivers, and discuss some possible strategies and resources that service providers can use to support caregivers during these uncertain times. We hope that these discussions will support parents and caregivers and families and, of course, service providers by providing some evidence-based information on topics that is relevant and responsive to the current climate. With that, we are very pleased to welcome our speaker for today, Dr. George Tarabulsi. George Tarabulsi is a full-time professor in the School of Psychology at Laval University. His recent work focuses on family and environmental factors involved in attachment development and emotional regulation, the development of attachment disorganization, and the prevention of developmental difficulties in psychosocially at-risk populations. Since 1999, he has been working actively on the development of intervention strategies based on the principles of parent-child attachment. Much of his work has been carried out in collaboration with Quebec social service institutions. It also focuses on the impact of prenatal maternal stress on child development and the role that the family and social environment can play in the life of the child and adolescent. Dr. Tarabulsi is currently leading the Generations Research Program, which focuses on the validation of a prevention and intervention protocol for families and addresses a number of fundamental questions about developmental processes. Thank you so much for joining us today, George, and I'll pass the floor to you now.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Isabelle and Christelle and Zindu and Bushra for this very generous invitation, and thanks everyone for being there. One of the things I would just add to the generous introduction, Zindu's generous introduction, is that I'm also involved in two different projects that involve how families respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. One of them deals with societal and national responses in child protection settings. This involves researchers from different countries who are asking the question, how has confinement and how has the actual disease changed family dynamics and child protection reports and the way that services respond to these reports. And the other is a major project led by a researcher here in Quebec City called MaViPan, which is Ma vie et la pandémie, my life and the pandemic. This is a longitudinal follow-up of about 4,000 individuals of different ages that are responding to a set of questionnaires. And we're learning some interesting details about how kids of different ages are responding to the pandemic and how parents are responding to the pandemic across time. It's been 2 years now, so there are some and it's been 2 years, and we've had a different regional disparities in how different health regulations were implemented across the province. And so we've had people respond differently to these different regulations. So it's actually kind of an interesting context. It's kind of a natural experiment to see how these different regulations in different areas are affecting parents and children differently. So as that data comes in, it might be interesting to talk about that as well. I'm very happy to be able to speak today about supporting parents during the pandemic. This has always been key to the work that I do. I'll be presenting a number of ideas dealing with intervention. I've kind of given up the idea of trying to decide whether they're my ideas or my collaborators' ideas. So I just list all my collaborators. So you have a kind of a short list there. Many of them are from university. All of them that are listed here are from universities in Quebec. I also want to underline the critical importance that practitioners and caseworkers in different kinds of interveners have had in developing the clinical ideas that we're working on right now. For practical and conceptual reasons, their contribution has been invaluable, and I obviously can't name them all, but it's a testimony, I think, to the interface between research and practice that we feel, our group feels, that we would never be where we are right now without that kind of collaboration. I don't know if you've seen the film. And obviously, if we were together in a big auditorium someplace and I were to ask you, have you seen the film, and you were to say no, then I would say that you would be ashamed of yourself, and everybody would know who you are because you would have raised your hand, and you would be ashamed of yourself, because this is a very, very important film. I think that if you haven't seen it, and if you were in one of my classes right now, I would tell you that your first bit of homework would be to go see this film. The Life is Beautiful story is the story of a boy and his father and his mother who end up in a concentration camp during the Second World War. Very hostile environment. The mother comes into play at some places, but she becomes kind of a secondary character. The key part of this story is really how the father does everything he can to protect the child from the negative impact of the environment that he's in. And if I were to say something about what we want to do with the parents that we work with, whether they be high-risk parents, low-risk parents, vulnerable parents, invulnerable parents, whatever, I think that one of the things that I would want to say is that what they do to protect their children from the environment that they're in is really key for the rest of their development. So this film provides kind of an interesting metaphor, an interesting way of presenting this idea that even in a hostile environment, the way that children are protected by that hostility, by the difficult situation, by their parents, is really critical to their later development. And in a certain sense, it's a metaphor for much of what happens. Parents are the last frontier in a certain way, in the way that they protect their kids. And that's true when there are very simple events that they have to cope with, whether it be school failure, whether it be not making a mini basketball team in grade 2, or whether it be pandemics. What parents do is important. And I know that there's a lot of people who will say that other things are important, and they would be right. There are other things that are important that influence child development. But on a very day-to-day level, if you were to have suggestions to people if you were to make suggestions to people for how to help child development in a time where we're wondering how children are responding to a major planetary situation, parenting would be the first place that you would look. And that's why I think there's a working hypothesis to be derived from this idea of protection. What I want to do in this talk today, this brief talk, and I hope that we'll be able to have a discussion and answer questions. What I would like to do is point to 3 different elements. The first is, what can we infer regarding the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on children? I'll focus mostly on young children because that's what my research deals with, but when I know something about older kids, adolescents, and young adults, and I'll be able to volunteer some of that information, and you should feel free to ask me about that as well. It's also a situation where it's not only research, it's not only the kind of research that we're used to in psychological and sociological areas that we should be concerned with. We should also be concerned with how people have thought about past events that are analogous to the global pandemic and how they've affected children and families. There's a lot to learn from all kinds of different natural experiments that we can apply to the current situation. And sometimes we think about it in terms of, well, when do we get out of the virus? When does the virus leave us alone? But sometimes we can ask the question, what were the negative effects of, say, for example, the 1918 pandemic on families and children? And when did that begin to show up? Did that show up in the first couple of years? Did that show up like 5 years later? How did that happen? And what were the comments that were made at that time? So I want to address those issues quickly with you. I also want to talk about concretely how we can help parents in the different settings. I understand that we have mostly people who work with parents that are with us today. So I want to talk about how to help parents. I want to point out some basic guidelines for how to address the anxieties that parents feel and how important it is to address them, and how a parent who feels listened to will be more effective in the way that they deal with their own kids. And then lastly, address the third issue, which is how do you deal with your own kids? How do you deal with how do parents deal with their own kids? And how does that guide what interveners do with families? I hope that that's a convenient outline. And, you know, if it's not, that's what I've prepared for you today. So we'll have to deal with that. Research on the effects of the pandemic underlined the generational impact of this type of event on child development. I think it's important to say that there is a lot of work that has been done, a surprising amount of work that has been done on how different issues surrounding the pandemic. And we're not just talking about getting the illness. We're talking about everything that the adjustments that have been asked of us have done to have the kind of impact that those adjustments have had on children. The research is absolutely incredible. I have been humbled by the amount of work that researchers and the speed with which they were able to turn around and do very significant research to ask the question, how do kids deal with this pandemic, and what kind of an impact are we looking at? And I think that the better studies that have been conducted are pointing in the direction of a generational impact. There are going to be some difficulties related to this pandemic that we're going to be dealing with for a number of years, and we shouldn't panic because of that. One of the things that I will want to say later on in the talk is that we've done this before. We've had major issues like this that we've dealt with before. We should be ready to face a kind of a long-term, slow burn type of recovery with our kids. There is no catastrophe, but the pandemic will have an impact as a function of the following elements in families. There are other contexts where the pandemic will have some influence. So the one that comes to mind quickly for me is school. In an excellent talk that Sylvana Coté gave a couple of weeks ago, I think, or last week, a couple of weeks ago, she was mentioning the number of days of confinement by country that countries have experienced and the children have experienced, and that clearly has an impact on the learning that kids do in school. And a very excellent study conducted in the Netherlands. The Netherlands is important because they have pretty much the same kind of confinement profile as Canada does. This study conducted in the Netherlands seems to show that kids from low-risk families have been exposed to something like, or are able to have learned something like 25% less information than kids prior to the pandemic in the same year. In that same study, they were able to show that high-risk kids in these contexts were exposed to 32% less learning. It's not in terms of days, but it's in terms of amount that they have learned. 32% is a lot for kids. That's a third less learning. We're not going to be able to fix that quickly. That's why I say there's a kind of a generational impact that we have to be conscious of, that we'll want to address in the long term. In families, I mean, that's the school context. I'm not here to talk to you about the school context, but I think it's important to know that it's not just families we're talking about. It's a more pervasive kind of an influence. In families, we know from many different studies, the family stress has increased, that the dynamics of families have changed. You have people who, you know, essentially would get up in the morning, would leave, go to work, go to school, come back, have dinner, do their homework. You know, there was a pattern, there was a kind of a rhythm to life that was upset in an important way. And what we've seen as a function of that are changes in family stress that change the family dynamics, or the changes in family dynamics that were able to change the family stress. The duration of these changes was very long. The on-off quality of these changes was very difficult to deal with. And there were also a number of changes that were kind of collateral effects of the pandemic that, you know, related to changes in the economy, changes in people's jobs, different issues that families had to compose with, children had to compose with, that affected the kinds of interactions that people had together in the home. The reason why that might be important is because interactions between parents and children, especially young children, are really one of the key vectors of development, one of the key influences on later outcome. So if parents are going through a lot and finding it difficult to deal with the changes that the pandemic is bringing to their lives, then it becomes important to ask the question, how is that impacting the way that they deal with their kids? How is that changing what happens with their kids on an emotional and a cognitive level? This isn't new. We've had these kinds of changes in our societies many times in the past. I name a few of them. We've had at least 3 major pandemics. One of them is not sure it was an actual pandemic, it was at least a very important epidemic, but we've had at least 3 major pandemics in the 20th century. And in the 21st century, we had a couple of good scares. And if you live in some parts of Africa, you had some pretty serious epidemics that were going on. So I mean, this is something that we've seen before. We have some information about the kinds of ways that people deal with these types of events. We've also experienced other kinds of events that can help us understand how people adjust. Major economic collapses have gone on. The most recent was only a few years ago in 2008. Maybe that, maybe I sound old when I say that 2008 was just a few years ago, but it was just a few years ago. 2008, major economic collapse in many parts of the world. We didn't feel it quite the same way here in Canada, but if you have American friends, you know that that was very, very painful. And in some parts of the world, they're still recuperating from that. If you live in a place where there's been armed conflict, and Lord knows that the 20th century was the century of armed conflict, and you ask the question, how do you recuperate from serious challenges to your person in that way? A lot of research has been done on that. It's interesting because I'm an attachment researcher. I study parent-child relationships, and the post-World War II era was extremely fertile for the development of our understanding of how people relate to each other, especially parents and children. It was after the Second World War that people asked the question, why do people become so aggressive? What happens in societies that creates a context where total war is an acceptable alternative? We can ask that question right now for some parts of Europe. We certainly can ask that question for some parts of the Middle East and Africa and Asia. What is it that makes people go to that extreme? And that happened in the fallout of a major geopolitical catastrophe, which was the Second World War. It's also at that time that people were asking questions, really big questions, which is going to be an issue that we'll want to deal with, about how people relate to each other, how people adjust to different situations, what parents do that is so important to children. I don't want to make too much of a big case out of this, but the war was an excuse to address created a context to address a number of really important social and I would almost say existential questions, which are very important for the way that we conduct our science in different areas right now and the way that we understand families right now. There are also natural disasters. I was in Montreal, in the Montreal area in the late 20th century. See, that sounds really old. I was in the Montreal area 20 some odd years ago when the ice storm hit. And I know that there were a number of studies that were conducted at that time, and there are a number of studies that show that there were different aspects of that particular natural catastrophe that influence how children develop. One of which were the excellent work conducted by Suzanne King at the Douglas, McGill and the Douglas, where she was able to show that prenatal stress, the stress created by the pandemic, had an impact on the way that children developed postnatally. And the way that they gained, the way that they were prepared for school, the way that their language developed, etc., as a function of prenatal stress experienced during that particular natural catastrophe. In each of these situations, in each of these contexts, there are documented effects on families, on parents, and child-based variables. The pandemic that we're going through right now is that kind of an event. I sometimes hear people say that there are studies that are conducted that show no results, that there are no effects on children. I mean, I've seen that a couple of times. And I sometimes wonder, that doesn't make sense to me right now. The way that I understand what has happened in the past and the way that that translates into how we understand child development should suggest to us that unless there's something that we've really missed, that we haven't understood about how kids develop, there should be this kind of an impact. That the event that we're going through right now worldwide has that kind of a potential impact. What might change it would be the manner in which social services, health services respond to that kind of an event. That will increase, amplify, or minimize the response that we'll have in that particular context. There are certain challenges that the COVID-19 pandemic presents, and that will make it different from other kinds of events. The fact that it is something that has been going on for a couple of years and that it has asked us to comply with government regulations on a very fundamental level is something that is different from, say, dealing with a 3 or 4 day natural catastrophe or something that lasts for a week or a couple of weeks that changes my life, but that at the same time doesn't ask me to have the same kind of response, long-term response. So there are characteristics that are there that are different, but it's that kind of an event that will have a generational impact on our children, on our families, on our children, perhaps even on the adults that are their parents. Overall, there are different ways that we can think about how events like the pandemic can have an impact on parents and on children. We just talked about, for example, the ice storm in Quebec, and we gave the example of, I spoke about how women who were pregnant during that time, who experienced major disruptions in their lives, were perhaps experiencing greater levels of stress, and that may have had an impact on the development of their children. That's one of the mechanisms. The question is, how do experiences translate to children? And in general, the major mechanism by which stress translates to children is that it runs through parents. It runs through the changes in the way parents interact with children. There's a vast literature that documents that changes in experiences, changes in stress, adversity, parental adversity, sometimes parental adversity that may have taken place many years before, will have an impact on how parents interact with their children in meaningful ways. There's even a theory, I cite an author here, Michael Runner, who's done a lot of work on the topic of resilience. And one of the theories is that if we're going to be resilient in adverse circumstances, it's going to be important for us to have at least a parental figure that is able to preserve quality relationships with us, even in the context of adversity. So it's the parent, but it's at least someone who is in our environment who is able to preserve. And this is where, the interveners and the caseworkers and the psychologists and those people who are involved with people on a weekly, daily basis become more important, because sometimes it's those people who become these alternate quasi-parental figures with children. From a public health perspective, the impact of, we talked about education, that's going to be more important. This is where public health has levers where they can act on. They can act on what happens in the school. They can also predict what might happen in terms of future mental health needs if children are having too much trouble dealing with the current situation. So it's important to focus on these particular issues as we plan ahead in terms of what we do with this. So we want to support parents. We want to do a couple of things. The first thing is we need to support parents for parents, because parents are people, right? And we want to make sure that as many people are able to navigate the particular situation that we're in. But we also want to support parents so that they may support children. And as I say this, I'm reminded of an analogy, of a parallel, of an analogy. If you've ever flown, if you've ever taken a flight, one of the explanations that the flight agent, what do you call it, agent de bord, of the stewardess, that's their old word.
Flight attendant.
Flight attendant, merci beaucoup. One of the things that the flight attendant will tell you is that if there's a sudden drop in pressure in the cabin, make sure that you put your mask on first before worrying about the person next to you, whether they have their mask on or not, right? The idea is that if you want to help the person next to you, make sure that you've got the resources yourself first so that you don't have an incident as you're helping somebody else. And it's a little bit the same with parenting. Parents have gone through a lot during this pandemic for different reasons, with confinement and forced homeschooling, with disruptions in their work, having to work at home at the same time as having small children in the home, sometimes having adolescents in the home. I have 4 children, and I've often been incredibly grateful that my children were all out of the house when, I have many friends whose children were in the house, and I said, send them to my house. They're nicer with neighbors, they're nicer with friends than they are with their parents. So send them to my house. I'll take care of them. We'll bubble for a while. It's very, very challenging to be a parent in this time. It was very challenging, and I don't want to talk about it like it's completely past tense, because we still have to worry about this thing, right? But it's a challenge. It's very difficult. Under the best of circumstances, being a parent is a very tough job. Bring in a pandemic, and you've made it incredibly exponentially more difficult. So support parents so that they may be better supports for the children and for the people who need them around them. And as with all support, we don't reinvent support. We don't reinvent clinical process. We don't reinvent working alliance. Those are all issues that just take on more importance. Emergencies and crisis situations and major demands for adjustment, like the pandemic has created in families, simply draws out these elements of good intervention that sometimes we kind of take for granted, but they just make them that much more important in that context. It's very complicated to support someone if you're not a good listener. If nothing major is going on, it doesn't show up too much. But if suddenly you have somebody who's having to deal with the major adjustments that they have to go through and you're not listening, then that could be a big, big, big issue. 3 elements of intentionality. I think that as I say this, I want to admit to feeling a little sheepish, because I think that everybody knows this. So I just want to say them. And if they're new, or if they're said differently, or then maybe you can make a comment about that. But I have the impression that this is very basic, but it needs to be said anyway. Three elements of intentionality that serve to support parents. The first is intentionality in reaching out, and I'm thinking of during the core of the pandemic, during the 2 years that we just gone through. But I'm also thinking now, as we're slowly kind of going back to some kind of normality, our tendency would be to think that everything is back to normal, not considering the possibility that we've changed somehow, and that being away from each other and having broken some of the major network research, social network resources that we had, that doesn't change us. We think that doesn't change. It changes us. People are not the same if you see them alone and when you see them with people. People are not the same when they know that there's somebody who can help them, or when they think that they're on their own. People do not behave the same. They don't think the same. They need to be put into contact with each other again. So the first point, and this is true now, but it's also true in the core of the crisis, there's an issue of being intentional in reaching out to parents and finding out how they are. Connect with them in some way. It can be different ways. It can be I'm the social worker at the local community mental health center, and I'm contacting parents. I want to know how parents are doing, what their questions are about their kids, and just become available to them and make that systematic. Make that part of a systematic way of connecting with parents, networking with parents, and being very intentional about it, because it's not going to happen by itself. It'll take too long to happen by itself. So that would be the first point, being intentional in reaching out at a time when it might be comfortable not to, for parents. Being intentional in listening to parents. I gave an example about listening. I think that the pandemic I mean, this is true all the time. The pandemic simply draws it out in clearer terms. But everybody has their experiences with the pandemic. For some people, I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, I was just ecstatic because my agenda kind of emptied itself of all its meetings. I had no meetings anymore. I could just do the work that I wanted to do. I was thrilled. It was wonderful. And then Zoom meetings came in. No, I didn't know that Zoom existed back then. So Zoom meetings came in, and all of a sudden I had this leviathan of Zoom meetings that I had to deal with on a daily basis. It became very, very complicated. And I remember talking with somebody, and they talked to me about, oh, gee, you need to learn more about how to organize your Zoom meetings, and organize how you deal with that. And I didn't realize that there would be this kind of thing. So one of the things that's really important is that somebody kind of said, well, how are you dealing with your Zoom meetings? Somebody just asked me, how are you dealing with your Zoom meetings? And I was able to tell them, gee, I'm kind of overwhelmed by Zoom meetings. There just seems to be too many. We had this discussion, and they were able to help me out with this particular situation. I think that this is an important issue. Everyone has a different pandemic experience. Everybody has gone through differently. We've had different experiences with the illness itself. Some of us have been ill, some of us have not. Some of us have been ill with a few symptoms. Some of us have been ill with major symptoms. Some of us have been hospitalized, some of us have not. Some of us have lost close people, loved ones. Some of us have not. Everybody has, jobs, family situations, etc. This is an important time to say in the strongest term possible that an important aspect of intervention is to listen to the story, listen to what's going on, hear what people have to say, hear what their surprises are, hear what their sorrows are about this time. It can be something like I this young couple that I know in the context of my work, they wanted to get married. They had planned their marriage, and the pandemic just canceled all of that for them. They had to do a Zoom wedding, and they still talk about it as if this was a kind of a reason for mourning. I mean, it's in a certain sense, people will say, well, that's kind of a middle class problem, but this is important for them. Everybody has their pandemic story that needs to be listened to. Everybody is facing a certain number of challenges, and it's important as an intervener to be in tune with those when you're working with parents. And then there's the idea of being intentional about active support. One of the things that I like to tell the interveners that I work with is that they really are windows on the world for many, many families that they work with. It's less true for, upper class or middle class families, but when you start working with lower middle class families or lower class families, families who are at high risk for different socioeconomic conditions, the social workers, the psychologists, the caseworkers, the different levels of interveners that work with families become kind of the connection to the outside world in many ways. They come with information, they come with resources, they come with the ability to connect parents to the outside world. And this is one of the qualities of the work that we do with families that I would not underestimate. It's very important to have this transactional ability put to the service of the families that we work with. This ability to be an agent for families is important. So one of the first things about being intentional in active support is sometimes to refer parents to the appropriate resources, sometimes to accompany them in those contexts. It's been a very long 2-year period, and connecting with these places might be a little more complicated than it was before, might be a little more anxiety provoking for some parents than it might have been at another time. The other area of intentionality is to talk with parents about the problems that they're experiencing. So when parents name problems, name issues, think about the typical situation where you had a small child at the beginning of the pandemic, and he's now 3.5 and he's becoming oppositional. What do you do with that? How do you deal with that? Well, the first part is to figure out that there are parenting issues often behind oppositional behavior. And not always, not all the time, but many, many times. And it's important to have a discussion about parenting issues, but you need to figure out that that's an issue. So Before you can do the problem solving, it's the intentional listening. And then before that would be the intentional reaching out. So there are different levels of intentionality. The last point on this list is, I think, is an important one as well. I think it's important to let people ask the big questions. The pandemic kind of forces that. When you're in a situation where you're in a daily grind, going to work and doing your thing, sometimes you're not always asking the important questions. But I think that the pandemic is one of these events where you stop and say, "Gee, I wonder what this is about. I wonder what I'm doing with this situation." And as I said, World War II was a very fertile, post-World War II was a very fertile ground for all kinds of theories developing regarding individual development and regarding societies. And I think that the pandemic can do that on a personal level as well. It's a time to ask these questions that sometimes in our Western, very individualistic, autonomous societies, we don't come to terms with very easily. So give parents permission to ask those questions and have those discussions with parents. I think it would be helpful. It's actually a way of finding meaning for people. In World War II, there was, and most of you will probably know this, there's a famous medical doctor who ended up in a concentration camp. His name was Viktor Frankl. And Frankl, was curious because there were people in the concentration camps who were just losing it, for understandable reasons. This is a concentration camp. But there were people who ended up being resources and support for other people. There were people who were organizing chess matches and who were trying to find ways to encourage others. And he was wondering, what was it about these people who were in these horrific situations that made them deal with the concentration camp environment in a way that they would turn to others and try to be helpful in a certain way? What was it about these people? And it was this idea that there was meaning that lay outside the concentration camp. You were not defined by who you were in the concentration camp. You were defined in another way. There was something else that was going on. Let parents ask the big questions. This is a time for them to be asking questions. And it doesn't mean that everybody will come to some great philosophical, existential philosophy about anything. I'm not saying that that's what everybody should be doing. But this is a time for these kinds of questions. All of a sudden, when the earth stops and our jobs change and we have to deal with different things, we need to be able to find our meaning in a way that exceeds that particular difficult context. I'm sure I'm not doing well for time. I'm sure that I'm late. Am I late? How much time do I have? 2 minutes?
There's still 5 minutes, so
okay, so I'm okay. All right, great, thanks. So we want to talk a little bit about children, and there's an analogy between how we hope that parents deal with children and the way that we just described that interveners deal with parents. There's a connection there. The first is be attentive to your kids, or to help parents be attentive to their children in their everyday lives, whether interacting with them or not. One of the more important ways that we have found that adults foster autonomy in children is that when children know that they're being watched, when children know that there's somebody that they can turn to, that they can count on in times when they're not doing well, then they will become more autonomous. Then they know that they can adventure out into their world, explore their world, understand their world, knowing that if they get stuck, that if something bad happens, that they can turn back and say, I need a hand, can you help me with this? And there's something important here. That means that there are a lot of interactions that go on that are direct child-parent interactions, but there are also interactions that go on where the parent is silent, where the parent just knows what's going on, is following the kids. And one of the things that we're asking parents in this particular context is, what do your kids say when you're not talking to them, but when they're talking with others? What do they say when they're talking to their siblings or when they're seeing their friends? If you want to have an insight into how they're dealing with these kinds of things, sometimes it's helpful just to listen, just to be the fly on the wall and to pick up on what's going on. It's the idea of having a radar. We use that when we work with parents. We tell them to just flick the radar on, figure out, listen, where are your kids? What are they doing? What's going on? What are they talking about? And just make a kind of a mental note about what's going on, and use that in your way of finding ways of being supportive to your kids. The second point is ask questions. Keep the questions short. Don't make it a pressure thing. There's nothing that my kids disliked more than when I sat them down and I said, let's talk. That really drove them nuts. The best conversations, not always, but some of the best conversations that I've had with my kids were in the context where I had to give them a lift someplace, give them a ride someplace. They were strapped in the seat next to me. They couldn't move and they depended on me. And I just kind of, asked questions and tried to be nice with them and try to figure out. And, there are opportunities that come up naturally for these questions to emerge. And I think you'd be surprised that children will sometimes take advantage to give you short answers that are filled with meaning. Everyone has enough experience with the pandemic now that these questions are easily addressable. They're easily addressed with kids. There are lots of opportunities for taking events and situations and making having a question about the pandemic come up. It's kind of a pervasive kind of an event, and there are different ways of addressing that with kids. Again, the importance of listening for parents. It has to do with asking questions and not being insistent. It's related to that. It has to do with not forcing issues. Listening also communicates something that's very important to kids, which is that I'm available. And I'm not worried about things not going well so that I feel better. I'm worried about how I'm asking questions about how you're doing. I'm asking questions about what you're going through, how you're thinking about these situations. I think I can deal with that. I'm asking you how you're doing. Many times and this is why it's important for parents to look after themselves, to have a positive look towards themselves in the situation. Many times, parents will communicate the impression that their children have to go well, otherwise the parents don't go well. So there's this is something that you want to make sure that isn't communicated. Children need to be able to express when they're not doing well to parents who are able to handle it. And if kids are doing well, then that's good. That's all the better. The point isn't that they have to communicate that they're not doing well, but you understand the point that I'm trying to make. Is you don't want the kids to feel that they have to communicate a certain way to parents so that the parents feel better. And on a more active level, it's appropriate to provide information, pertinent information, when necessary. Again, without pressure. Again, don't expect that because you've said it, kids will understand it, but it has to be part of the conversation at home. Examples of information that kids might respond positively to in the medium term are things like, well, our family has chosen to do everything we can to help slow the illness. So this is how we're going to organize our house. This is how we're going to organize our time together. This is how we're going to organize, visits to grandma's, or this is how we're going to organize our work schedule or school schedule. We're going to do this because we're taking this seriously and we want to deal with it. We want to cope with it. We're being active in that particular process. If we do get sick, there's good reason to think that we're not at high risk. That's something that might be helpful to say to some kids. And if one of us gets sick, this is how we're going to deal with it. This is how we're going to cope with it. This is how we're going to isolate. So there are things that you can talk about with kids when in providing information. Again, providing information doesn't change everything instantly. It just provides a context, the ground on which other conversations can take place, other events can take place. When something does happen, you can refer back to these particular conversations. And last but not least, I think it's important to have healthy distractions. Playing games, reading stories, finding old books, finding new books, spending time with kids. Again, this is difficult. It's difficult for parents, and I guess I was surprised to see how complicated it was for people who don't spend so much time together. Parents and kids just don't spend that much time together, to suddenly be forced together 24/7. That was very complicated. How do you deal with that? Under normal circumstances, time spent with kids and the quality of interactions are very important vectors of adjustment. these take on added importance, and the quality issue is more important. So think about these things. Again, there's an intentionality quality to this. Daily activities and events are important. In the post-pandemic period, you can even start asking questions about what have you done today that you didn't do for 2 years, but that you did before, and how did that feel? How did that work? Playing games, exploring new interests, looking at old interests. We talked a little bit about the challenges of education and academic achievement. One of the interesting hypotheses that are coming out from research on education is the importance of improving ratios in the classroom as a way of compensating for the pandemic. And that's done by, we know that kids learn better when ratios are different in classrooms. Not when they're 2 or 3 kids lower, but when there's a substantial change. So one of the things that schools and school boards are experimenting with is the ability of bringing in people who will establish one-on-one, one-on-two, one-on-three relationships with subgroups of kids who are perhaps at a greater risk, and working with them on a daily or at least weekly basis to work to improve academic achievement and to make them at lower risk for difficulties in school as a function of the pandemic. I think that's a really interesting idea. That's a kind of support, and that's a kind of thinking outside the box that is needed in our school settings to help us with the adjustments that are necessary in this particular time. And I think the last thing I want to say is that it's not all bad. I think it's important. I mean, I don't want to sugarcoat it. Pandemic is like, ugh, I never thought we would go through this. I keep thinking, wow, we've gone through a pandemic. It's just incredible. I hope we never have to go through this again. At the same time, I know that there are events in people's lives and in societies and contexts, and just a quick run through the front pages of the New York Times will convince you that that's true. There are events that just change things, and a pandemic is one of them. So it requires an important degree of adjustment, but hopefully it will also be accompanied by this ability that we have that's part of who we are in a certain sense, part of humans, to interact with each other, to find new ground, to adjust to this new reality that we're in. I think I can go to work and work now, but there are, for different reasons, there's something about staying home and speaking to you here, which is just so much simpler. Is that the new norm? How does that make things easier for me? How does that make things more complicated for me? There's this discussion that we need to have about potential changes and adjustments that in the long term will have an impact on who we are, how we deal with our kids, how we deal with our families. This analogy that I like, which comes from my own work in the study of attachment relationships. Interactions are important, daily interactions are important, but the thing that builds trust in children is the way that you respond to their distress. Building trust in children is, you can play with them, and that's important. You can have fun with them, and that's important, and that contributes. But if they're stuck with something, if there's a major issue going on with them, the way that you respond to that distress is going to be very, very important. And I think that on some level, that's not just a thing between parents and kids. I think that that's something that is important for humans. If you're in a very tight situation and you have a good friend who's able to bail you out, there's a different kind of connection between you and that friend after that. And I think that is something that we can experience in the context of the pandemic. I think that that's from a social and from a psychological perspective, I think that there's this issue of how we relate to each other during this time, which can actually make at least part of that experience a better experience, an adaptive experience, something that will contribute to how we'll come out on the other end. That's the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Georges. I read your presentation before you gave it, and I had questions, but then I have more. But I'm
Okay.
gonna be. I want to say that I particularly appreciated the fact that you bring us back to hope, right? That within this kind of context, there are learnings that are there that may change things. That questions about life that are there. So it really comforted me. So I want to say thank you to that. And also, you know, in our work with supporting parents and families, I think that the fact that you brought, you know, those intentionality about reaching out, and, you know, about, you know, those cues that you gave about the importance of feeling for parents, or, I mean, for all of us to feel that we are somebody is there for us, and it may change our own behaviors and maybe adjust differently to our children. I think it's very interesting. You said it was all maybe so obvious, but I don't find it that obvious.
Well,
That
thank you.
just to remind ourselves that, right, reaching out, that means that we feel that somebody's there for us, and it changes maybe the way that we are building trust for our own children. So I want to thank you for this. And also about listening to parents, you know, it may be so obvious that we all are experiencing the same thing, but you said no. Well, you know, you brought back the fact that we may all experience different things, we just don't know. So the way of that you brought back, you know, the idea of being there for parents to maybe be curious about what they are experiencing. I want to thank you for that. So one specific question. Do you think that there really is something different that we should do in order to support parents or children in this specific context? Is it really so different, as, you know, you compared, you know, we already went through those crises in the
Right.
past, but then in this specific context, is
Yeah.
this something that we must adjust in our support to parents?
I think that that's a good question, because I think that we're so interested in getting back to normal. You know, we're so interested in getting things at the same speed as we were at before, that we forget that we have this tendency to isolate a little bit. And there's something for many people. I'm not saying this is the same for everybody. I don't think everybody exactly has the same tendency, but there, for many people, this tendency to isolate has just been heavily reinforced during the pandemic. And I really think that it changes people. I think that there's a difference. I want to be careful about how to talk about that, because it's hard to be. It's a little bit like asking a fish what is water. You know, they'll say, "What's that?" You know, they don't know what you're talking about. So, but being in a pandemic and adopting new ways of living in your family, in your work, and away from people, creates a different kind of individual. And I think that on a very real level, it's important for people who are in social services, for people who are in big families, you know, people who have extended time, to connect. It's important to reach out and to connect, to get something about that social fiber ignited again. This is different in the pandemic because everybody was in it at the same time. That tendency that I'm describing is actually part of a mourning response that somebody can have when somebody passes away. It's something that if you live through some great heartache, like a very difficult romantic relationship breakup or something like that, many people will fall back into those patterns. But imagine a society falling back into that kind of pattern, then that can be a big issue. So there's an intentionality to reaching out that is really important, especially in this particular context.
And then would you suggest, from a service provider's perspective, that we should maybe try to reaching out by also organizing in partnership with others in our context, maybe places where parents have time, you know, to play with their children? And would you suggest that we could be more proactive in this?
I think that we need to be. I think that there's something about the context which helps us to see that we would need to be. I'm not sure exactly what form that could take. I've seen some, there are some people who are actually in some communities, there are some people who are, putting on impromptu discussions, conferences, different things that are fairly simple to organize, and inviting people to come. It's not necessarily a parenting thing. It's like, we're allowed to do it now. Please come because we want to see people. You know, it's and I think it's those kinds of events are going to be more meaningful. But in terms of parents, this is where let's talk about our families. Let's talk about our kids. Let's talk about, and let's have the discussions that we need to have about how our kids are coping with this situation. there's some literature with adolescents that show that they're having a particularly difficult time during this particular, for many different reasons, it's been more difficult for adolescents. You know, I would suspect that there are a lot of parents who are looking for answers right now and who need to connect on that level.
So reaching out is a key, and be innovative, as
Yes.
we know, all those centers, all the work that is there, it's innovation. Thank you, Georges.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Georges.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. We do have a few minutes if there are any questions or comments. We do have one question. Thank you from me as well, George, and thank you, Isabel, for some great points that you made, especially the message, while serious, is also hopeful. And I think, as some people have pointed out, you know, family resource centers and others, the service providers have been playing these roles and reinforcing how important these interventions are.
Right.
Has been very helpful, I think. There's one question from Wanda. She's wondering how to advocate for parents and perhaps amplify their voices in government and other agencies, maybe on a larger platform. So perhaps that intentionality that you were speaking about, but on a larger platform.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I often think that parenting and social services are, you know, in spite of all of the economic evidence that exists showing that they're so important for societies, they're often the enfants pauvres. They're often the lastly funded services. I mean, and I won't go into that. I get very irritated when I talk about it, so I have to be careful how I talk about it. So yes, we need to be doing something about that. Two points about that. The first is that there are organizations who are listened to by government, who need to organize themselves to be heard on a more consistent level with government. In Quebec, we recently had changes to child protection laws where no researchers were listened to. So I mean, to me, this sounds absolutely ridiculous. You don't change laws to child protection services and the organization of services without speaking to the researchers, to parent organizations, none of that was done. So it's the kind of thing where if we were more organized, we could be heard more easily. So that's the first point. The second point is that a lot of this organization doesn't have to involve government. I think that a lot of many movements, and in fact, many of the data-driven prevention programs that we have emerged from very community-based organizations that didn't involve government. I think that much can be done that doesn't involve government to make communities and families stronger. And this is where it's a more local kind of situation, and it's something where lower key organization can have very positive effects on families and on kids.
Thank you so much, George. We will have to start wrapping up now. I have a few housekeeping points to make, but thank you so much for your really great presentation, and thank you, Isabel, for some very good questions.